Okay, hey everybody, welcome back. Tonight we're going to talk about just an introduction to viticulture and enology, and of course this is for Viti 300, my online course, which is Introduction to Viticulture and Enology. So wonderful. Glad you guys could make it. Okay, so overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. We have a part 1, 2, and 3. Part 1 is just like an introduction to winemaking, how it's made, and some terminology. Part 2 is we're going to talk about where wine flavors come from. And then part 3, we're going to talk about the concept of terroir, which is a French word, philosophy in winemaking, meaning like a sense of place for the wine. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. So part 1, how wine is made, featuring some terminology. So viticulture is the study of grape cultivation. So anything to do with the vineyard, the vines, the plant biology, fertilizers, grape development, soil science. There's a lot that goes into it, right? So that's viticulture. It's grape cultivation. Enology is more specifically fermentation science. It's more of the winemaking side of things, right? So study of fermentation science that includes knowledge of chemistry, biochemistry, microbiology, chemical engineering, and also nutrition. And then there's winemaking itself. The act of winemaking involves a knowledge of enology, right? But it's the series of operations from harvesting grapes through providing bottled wine ready for the consumer. So that is the act of winemaking. So in a lot of smaller wineries that are local, a lot of times the winemaker is the enologist and is the viticulturist as well. When you go into like much more large corporate winery situations, like some things that are in Napa, you will have like an enologist, someone who just focuses on the chemistry of the wine and monitoring it, versus a winemaker who might call the shots in the cellar and coordinating and work with blending, versus like the viticulturist who is strictly in the vineyard, right? So these might be separate positions, or it might be one person does it all, depending on what type of business that you're working with. So important distinctions and terminology. Okay, so jumping right into how white wine is made. We're actually going to have another presentation that just follows winemaking a little more in detail after this one, but I just kind of want to expose you more than one time so things can stick the more that we expose you to this information. So for white wine, generally it's made with white or green grapes, right? So you can call them white grapes or green grapes. They look green in the field when they ripen, but sometimes we just call them white grapes because they make white wine, right? So you pick the grapes, then you would typically press the grapes immediately. So this could be a whole cluster press. And then the main point is you want to just remove the juice from the skins immediately, right? So you'd take that raw juice product, then you would cold settle it. You'd put it into a tank and let it get really cold, and all the pulp will settle to the bottom, all the gunk or dirt. Then you would rack it after 3 days. And this is all very this is kind of textbook white winemaking, but when we get into talking about winemaking, especially in our winemaking class that we offer in the fall, you'll find that there's like many different ways to do it. So this is not like the way. There's lots of different ways just depending on what you're trying to achieve. But this is kind of like a good baseline to reference for winemaking, right? Okay, so you have your raw product. You let all that gunk settle out. Then you rack, which is the process of transferring wine off of some kind of sediment or just moving it from vessel to vessel, right? Then once you have kind of like your more clean juice product, you're going to start your first fermentation, which is also known as primary fermentation. Primary fermentation converts sugar to alcohol with the use of yeast, right? Once that has finished, you rack off any leftover sediment and yeast, and then you can go through a secondary fermentation, which is optional. It's not required for all white wines. Like Sauvignon Blanc is typically not, has not gone through secondary fermentation. If you have ever had like a buttery Chardonnay, that buttery component, that creaminess, is an indication that it did go through secondary fermentation, right? So that's a stylistic choice. So that secondary fermentation, it's called malolactic fermentation. It converts malic to lactic acid. So malic, think Spanish mal, which is bad, M-A-L. Think that's very harsh. It's underripe acids that are found like literally in underripe fruits. And then lactic acid is what we find in like yogurt and more creamy dairy products. So it's creamier, softer acid. It also creates diacetyl compounds, which are those buttery flavors that we find in buttery Chardonnay, right? Then once that's complete, if you do take your wine through secondary fermentation, you'd rack it off of the leftover sediment and yeast, and then you have like a raw product, right? And then we could talk about filtration and instability and all these other fun things, but that is like the very like basic steps for how to make a white wine, right? And the big things I want you to take away from this is that you take a grape and you remove the juice from the skins immediately. Then you ferment that juice on its own to make a colorless product and a colorless alcohol, right? So that is like the big takeaway from how white wine is made, right? We'll get into more detail next lecture about that, right? Okay, red wine is different on the other hand, because what gives red wine its beautiful color is the contact with the skins, right? So you would harvest the grapes. We call them red grapes, but Psalms like to call them black grapes, like they're black skinned, right? So whatever you prefer to call the grape, a darker skin colored grape, you take it, you harvest it, and then you would typically crush and destem it. So you take all those lovely clusters, you put it through the crusher destemmer. It takes all of the berries off of the center stem, the rachis. Then it would take those berries and then it would put them through a crusher, which would open up the berry and break open the skins and release the juice, right? And then all of that comes together into like a big soupy mixture, and it starts to ferment. So must is the skins, the seeds, the pulp, the juice that comes together for the fermentation to start, right? Once you have that like soupy mixture, you start primary fermentation, which converts, again, sugar to alcohol through yeast. Then once all of your fermentation has been completed, all the sugar has been converted to alcohol, you would then press. So you're going to drain that tank, shovel out all the skins that are left over from that skin contact. You're going to load that into a press, and then a press will actually squeeze all of that newly fermented wine from those skins. The skins that are left behind are called pumice. So I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you and not any visual aids. So we do have a really nice video here through YouTube called Introduction to Winemaking, and it goes over a lot of this information for you guys, right? So feel free, if you want to, click on this link and you can see some more information. Okay, after you press the grapes, you've removed the newly fermented wine from the skins, also known as pumice at that point, right? You put that wine into a tank or a barrel, and you start your second fermentation. The second fermentation of red wines is very critical. It's part of stability and mouthfeel processes for the wine. For this, we add a bacteria to convert, again, the malic into lactic acid, just like you would for a white wine if you wanted that style, which will make a softer, better mouthfeel, creamier wine. Once it's done with second fermentation, you'd rack it off the leftover bacteria and sediment, and then you'd let that newly fermented or finished wine age in a barrel for about 18 or so months. However long to age it is completely up to the producer. We've seen lots of different things from 4 months to 3 years, whatever. It just depends on the wine, their ability to hold it, right? That's a lot of overhead costs to store and age wine, and what type of style they're trying to achieve. So I know there's a lot of information. Feel free to replay it. Definitely watch the video. Lots of visual aids will help you understand the process. And also, if you have that Wine Folly book, there are some really nice pictures there too, and also on her website, Wine Folly. If you look up Wine Folly, how wine is made, that's also a good resource. Okay, so what is wine exactly, right? So if you come from backgrounds where you've been exposed to people making like homebrew and stuff like that, you might have heard of like apple wine or blackberry wine or elderflower wine. Traditionally, wine is fermented grape juice, but another classification of a fruit wine would be that it's around 14% alcohol by volume, or ABV, right? So it just depends on the product. Normally, when we talk about wine, we're talking about grape wine. So wine can actually reach as low as 5.5% and up to 16%. Other styles of wine include red, white, rosé, Beaujolais, dessert port wines, champagne, sparkling, and many, many more, right? There's lots of different types of wine out there. And it's made all over the world. So here's a little bit about that fruit wine situation I was just talking about. So here in the Sierra Foothills and Apple Hill region, we do produce apple wine, which is very fun for tourists and people who live here alike to come and enjoy. So the difference in how like a regular wine from grapes versus apple wine would be is that for apple wine or other fruit-based wines besides grapes, we actually have to add sugar to it to bring the alcohol level up to what a wine would be. Otherwise, it's really just a cider. Ciders are lower in alcohol, like an alcoholic cider, right? We're not talking about the apple cider that we enjoyed as kids from Bar Sodies, right? This would be like a true alcoholic cider, right? So you could make apple wine, pineapple wine, blackberry wine, you name it. You just have to add some more sugar to bring that alcohol level up to wine category. Cool. Okay, as far as grape varieties in California, interestingly enough, well, at least in 2021, we did get some new numbers on this, but in 2021, the number one grape variety planted in or crushed in California was Chardonnay. So Chardonnay is leading the group by 16%, followed very closely by Cabernet Sauvignon. And then we have Zinfandel, Pinot Noir, French Colombard, Pinot Gris, Ruby Red, Merlot, and then also Muscat of Alexandria. So Chardonnay and Cab are like the biggest products, the biggest varieties of like Napa, Sonoma, also like Paso Robles. There's some really large winemaking regions here, Lodi as well, right? So these are kind of like monsters of wine industry that produce mass amounts of wine, like cumulatively together, right? Huge volume of Cab and Chardonnay. Zinfandel is like one of the exclusive grapes to California. It's like one of our major contributions to the world is Zinfandel. And you can also see that in a lot of mass market wines and also on like smaller side production as well. Pinot Noir is highly produced in like Santa Cruz, Sonoma, and some of the coastal regions of California. So there is definitely a market for that. French Colombard is an interesting one. French Colombard, unfortunately, has kind of been like pigeonholed for like mass production box wine. Basically, it's a white grape variety that produces white wine. It's a very large yielding variety, and that's mostly what it's used for. Then we have Pinot Gris, Ruby Red, Merlot, Muscat. You know, Merlot is another, like, at least it was, a very popular grape variety. Unfortunately, because of Sideways, it got kind of a bad reputation, but it is still a mass-marketed variety. It does very well in California, so it is still one of the most crushed and planted varieties, right? And then Muscat of Alexandria is definitely, it's for sweeter wines that we generally use it for in California. Again, box wine production, mass production situations, you see a lot of Muscat, right? And then we have a whopping 28% of other varieties. So California is extremely diverse in the grape varieties that we produce. We have lots of microclimates, elevation changes, a lot of like the smaller winemakers that own their business, own the winery, and that are like family run and operated, have a lot of pride in producing like multiple varieties. Like if you come to Boger, you'll see that we've planted over 31 different varieties there. Shout out to Madronia, Lava Cap. We have also, who am I thinking of? We just have a lot of wineries that produce a huge, diverse menu of varieties from all parts of the world. We have Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, Argentina, right? So it's very interesting to see that much diversity. So I really encourage you to go out to your tasting rooms, try something you haven't had before. We have just a lot of very cool stuff. Okay, so American viticultural area. This is a very important vocabulary word to know. This is also known as AVA, So that's the acronym for it, American Viticultural Area, AVA. This is a legal designation to benefit the wineries and wine consumers for specific areas in the U.S. It's also known as an appellation. So why is this important? This is important because we need to be honest to our consumers about what we're presenting for our wines, what we're charging for our wines, but also this helps consumers identify characteristics in wines that might come from those regions that they might like or prefer, and it helps them with their shopping, right? So sometimes wine people who like to drink wine will follow like a certain producer. Sometimes they like to follow a certain region of winemaking just because they like the grapes that are grown there. So it's just one more tool to help that communication and to be honest, right? It also helps to prevent fraud. So it would be very unfortunate, right, if a Napa company purchased wine very cheap from Lodi and then won lots of awards for it and charged extremely high amounts for it and then didn't give credit to that winery or that vineyard in Lodi, right, for the wonderful fruit that they grew. So helps prevent fraud. It also helps set expectations for the characteristics of the wine. It's also used for marketing, right? So kind of like I talked about, consumers go shopping for wine. They say, hey, like, I really like, Santa Lucia Pinot Noir, right? So they're going to be looking for Santa Lucia specifically on that wine label to shop for something that they enjoy. Or maybe they see a new region that they've never had before, and they're like, hey, like, Alta Mesa, Lodi, I've never had that before. How is that different than the rest of Lodi, right? So it can help them make decisions and understand the characteristics that certain AVAs give to wine. Currently, there are over 107 AVAs just in California alone, which is crazy and like impossible to keep up with, and new ones are being added every year. So there is a debate going around about if we have too many AVAs, that it's becoming kind of like information overload, right? Is it really valuable to people if they don't understand it? I mean, it's hard to say. So we have a lot of AVAs in California. Okay, part 2. Where does flavor and aroma come from? So when you're drinking wine and say like you have a Pinot Gris, right? It's a white wine and you're in the tasting room and you're like, wow, this tastes like apples. Like, did you put apples in the fermentation? No. The answer is no. We did not. So there's different parts of the process where flavor and aroma comes from in wine, right? And it's all this really interesting transformative chemistry and like precursors that are found in the juice itself, right? So one is the grape itself. So flavors come from different varieties. The grapes have different, compositions. It could be the vineyard it's grown in, the elevation. We'll talk more about that, right? So ultimately, one starts at ground zero, the product that you harvested, the grape itself, right? Number 2 is activity of microorganisms, like what type of yeast you picked. Did you take it through secondary fermentation or not? We'll talk about this more in the next slides. We have our processing choices. So this is kind of like the winemaking, extraction, the heat of fermentation, how hard did we press, did we not press? And then we have aging, last but not least. So how long you chose to age your wine, what type of oak you decided to use. Did you do no oak? Is it stainless steel? So all those wonderful things. So these are all major components to determine where wine flavor comes from, right? So number 1, the grape itself. So the grape itself encompasses a huge part of the flavors, right? So the variety, the clone, the rootstock you used, the soil that it was grown on, how you managed your canopy, were there pest pressures in the vineyard that year, were there disease pressures, the climate, right? So the amount of rainfall, humidity, sunshine, wind that the vineyard received. Then we also have the microclimate of the cluster. Was it really humid? Did it become moldy? We have seasonal variations, and we also have just in general vineyard practices. Are you biodynamic? Are you organic? Are you a conventional farmer? These are all things that are going to impact the flavor of that grape when you harvest it, right? So here is a picture on the bottom right of botrytis infected grapes. So this is something, as we'll find out in the next lecture, is actually utilized to make some really high quality dessert wines. But this is a fungus that comes in, and with the right humidity will start to attack the grapes. And what you see with this discoloration is starting to turn kind of this like brownish color is the fungus attacking the clusters. It's utilizing those sugars, but it's also like changing the flavors of the cluster as well. So it's a lot kind of like, it's like blue cheese kind of, where it's like it's a fungus or a mold that is, it's not like it's beneficial for your health. It's not going to hurt you. It's not going to be dangerous to consume, but it's something that's utilized in the process to create certain flavors in the wine, right? And the flavors are going to be more like honey-like characters. It's not going to taste like mold or mildew, right? Okay, activity of microorganisms. So the most commonly used yeast in the wine industry to convert sugar to alcohol is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Saccharomyces species in general are all very good yeasts, right? So these are the most prominently used in wine, beer, and baking. It is believed to originate from grape skins, which is very cool. Here we have a photo of what Saccharomyces cerevisiae looks like. Other types of microorganisms that we use are lactic acid bacteria. This is something that can ferment glucose into lactic acid, which can make wine taste sour. And then we also have like native yeast and bacteria. So just the native flora that exists in your winery or in your vineyard is going to be present on anything that you touch and anything that you harvest, right? So it just, if you choose to ferment with that, you can. That is an option to do a native ferment. But that's a whole nother conversation in the winemaking alley. So I'll skip that for now. So yeah, whatever type of microorganisms are involved are definitely going to impact the flavor. Just like if you ferment your bread with sourdough, the sourdough starter versus like a regular starter, right? So sourdough and French bread taste completely different. Those are the flavor impact of those microorganisms, right? Same thing for wine. Okay. Processing decisions are very important, right? So this is where a lot of winemaker does decide about the microorganisms, but winemaker also makes decisions on processing and how things are going to look, right? And it's always a strategic choice to obtain a certain style or convey certain flavors in the wine, right? So things that can impact this are your harvesting conditions, your maceration choices. So to macerate, that is how you choose to put the skins into skin and juice contact, for how long, and for how and what way. Do you put through the crusher destemmer? Do you do a whole cluster? And then we have your extraction conditions. Are you going to do like a cold fermentation, a hot fermentation, for how long? Any additions that you make to the juice or must, that will impact it. So acid, water, oak chips, right? You can add oak chips during fermentation. Your fermentation conditions, lees contact. Lees is the leftover sediment of yeast and bacteria after fermentation, and it can be utilized to improve the mouthfeel of a wine. We also have clarification processes, filtration, fining, blending, and also like stabilization treatment. So many things, right, that can impact the flavor of the wine ultimately. Okay, and then number 4 is aging decisions. This feels a little more straightforward because the longer that you age it, right, the more the wine's going to change. The temperature and cooperage are important. Temperature is like how hot or cold you keep your cellar. That'll make a difference on how rapidly it ages, and also could potentially lead to like spoilage if it's too hot, right? We also have the pH of the wine, the composition of the wine, evaporation, agitation, the amount of oxygen exposure it has, lees exposure, and then also your overall sanitation practices, right? So all of these things will affect the wine as it ages and impact the flavor of the final product. So a lot of things. Okay. Now we'll just go ahead and jump into terroir. So terroir is a French concept. It means a sense of place. So it means there's the surrounding area on the grapes has an influence, and that is shown in the wine. So when you taste that wine, it transports you to that region, right? So there are 4 components of terroir. It's climate, soil, topography, and surrounding plants. So whether you have a hot or cold climate, or growing temperature, growing season, this will affect the style of wine. The type of soil that you have, whether it's clay, sand, silt, loam, the drainage, nutrients, this will affect the growth of the vines, the health of the fruit, and therefore the flavors as well. We also have topography, so the hills, the shade, sun exposure, your elevation, right? These are all things that are going to affect how it ripens, how it grows. And then we also have your surrounding plants, so all the flora around you. So like if you talk about like wines from Australia, right, sometimes reds can have a eucalyptus flavor because eucalyptus trees grow around the vineyard. That's a really good example of surrounding flora, surrounding plants affecting the wine, right? And that's because eucalyptus trees are very oily. The oil from the leaves will spray onto the clusters and onto the vines, and then that eucalyptol chemical will actually transfer into the resulting wine, right? So this all affects the flavors of wine and will reflect the region that it was grown on, or the terroir. This is a concept. This is the definition of terroir in wine. Okay, so to kind of dive deeper into these things, so climate affects the ability to ripen, acid and sugar levels in the grape, right? So if you have a cool climate wine, it's typically slower. The fruit took longer to ripen. It's slower ripening, so you have lower sugars but higher acid. Typically, when grapes ripen, as sugar starts to climb during the ripening stage, acid will start to deplete, right? So it's an inverse relationship. So there'll be lower sugars and higher acid because in a cooler climate, it has a harder time ripening, right? These wines can be described as elegant, nuanced, refreshed, and delicate. And common descriptors can be cranberry, sour cherry, green apple, black pepper, and Syrah, and then more forest floor and Pinot Noir. For a hot climate, this is faster ripening, right? It's warmer, so we'll have generally higher sugars in these grapes, which result in higher alcohol. We'll have lower acid and then also thicker skins, so more tannin potentially as well. So these are typically powerful, robust, fuller-bodied wines, and their descriptors are more like ripe fruit, so plum, blackberry, blueberry, and chocolate as well. So just depending on the variety. Cool. So there's a macroclimate and there's a microclimate. Macroclimate are just very broad senses of climate, right? So if you drive through California and you go through Sacramento during the summer, it's very hot, right? So it's the valley, Sacramento Valley. Inland area is very hot. If you keep going towards the coast, you will hit a much cooler region, right? It starts to feel a lot nicer. Those are considered cool climate growing regions, right? So those are typically coastal areas that are influenced by a marine layer or a large body of water, which helps to regulate temperature and keep the region overall cooler, right? So overall, most of California wine regions are considered Mediterranean, but there are still differences in temperature here. So it still shows in the wines made from the regions. The average temperature affects what grape varieties grow well and also the style of the wines. So we just have a picture of the Köppen climate types or classification system and a climate map. You're welcome to take a look at it, but as you can see, most of these regions are either classified as like a warm summer Mediterranean or a hot summer Mediterranean, right? We have these different shades of yellow and green in most of the foothills, the valley, and then also the coastal as well. But this map is also a good representation of like how much warmer it is in the Valley of California, and then when you hit these mountain ranges, the Sierra Nevadas, and also this one on the coastal side, it gets a little bit cooler, right? Cool. Okay, so here's just a picture of average growing season temperatures and like what varieties do well there. So generally speaking, like on the cool to intermediate growing season temperatures, we see a lot more white grape varieties like Pinot Gris, Riesling, Chardonnay, Sauv Blanc, right? Pinot Noir also generally does well in cooler regions. As we get to more warm regions, we have a lot more reds and then some bolder whites, right? So you can grow Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay in these warm regions, but in a very hot region, it might be difficult. But the reds really come out and start to shine in some of these hotter regions, right? So it just depends. You'll have to, if you are going to purchase a property and plant grape varieties, you will want to look at what your climate is, what index region that you are in, and then you can compare it to other regions of the same index and see like what's planted there, what does well, and then potentially see what would be best for you. So that would all be available on the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Grape Crush Report. They do one annually, and they have a split out by region and county, a growing region, and then you can see exactly like how many tons of fruit was crushed, what was planted, and even what they sold the fruit for, so the value of the crop. So that's very helpful information. Cool. Okay. Put a star on the slide. This is always a great slide for quiz questions. I really like the comparison here. So we have cool versus hot climate wines. So for a cooler climate wine, it'll be less ripeness in fruit, which brings more tart, bright fruit flavors. Higher acidity and low sugar. So less ripeness, low sugar, high acid. Low sugar means low alcohol, and low alcohol means lighter body, generally speaking, right? And on the opposite of that, if it's the same grape variety produced in warmer conditions or a hot climate, we have more ripeness in the fruit. It's typically more sweeter fruit flavors. Not necessarily that the wine itself is sweet, but like ripe fruit flavor in the wine, right? We also have lower acidity and higher sugar. Higher sugar means higher alcohol, and higher alcohol means it's a fuller bodied wine. And if you're new to wine tasting or just wine in general, we're talking about body, we're talking about density of the product. So it'd be like comparing drinking water to drinking milk. So water would be light-bodied, milk would be full-bodied, right? So it actually has a weight to it in your mouth, and it coats your mouth. That is a fuller-bodied wine. So, and that can be impacted by the alcohol, residual sugar, tannins. I think that's it. I think this was the 3. Yeah, so those are things to look for in wines. Cool. And then we have this WSET comparison of climatic influences. I really appreciate this because this is a really nice like visual. So here are examples of Chardonnay produced in 3 different climates. We have a cool climate, a moderate, and then a hot climate Chardonnay. The cool climate has high acid, green and citrus fruit, and even some vegetable components in it. So cucumber, lemon, apple, pear. Sounds very nice. So that's going to be a cool climate Chardonnay. A moderate climate will still have some citrus fruit, but it will also have some stone fruits. So stone fruits are like peaches, apricots, like anything with a seed on the inside, that's a stone fruit. And then also some tropical fruit like mango, right? Then on a hot climate, we still have tropical fruit, but it leans more towards the ripe tropical fruit, so like banana, pineapple, peach, mango, and fig. So much riper flavors in general. And again, I do want to stress, it doesn't necessarily mean that these wines are sweet. These are just the flavors that come out depending on the climate it was grown in. So keep track of that. Okay, here's that relationship of that grape ripening I was talking about, how sugar and acid are an inverse relationship. So for berry ripening, we have 3 stages, stage 1, 2, and 3. And as you can see in stage 3, the red line is sugars and the blue line is acids in the grape. As we reach the final stage of development, sugars start to skyrocket and acids start to deplete. So if you're in a cool climate, you're more likely on the left side of this intersection, right, where acids are high and sugars are low. Then if you're in a hot climate, you're more likely on the right side of this intersection, right, where sugars are high and acids are low. So, yeah, hopefully that helps. For this graph, did I put it in there? I really just want you to focus on stage 3 and the inverse relationship of acid and sugars. I'm not going to ask you what happens in stage 1 and stage 2. I just want you to know that while grapes are ripening, acids deplete, sugar accumulates, and what marks the stage is veraison. That's going to be important for you to know. Cool. Okay, so moving on to soil. So soil is very important in vineyards. It's the ground, literally, right, that we produce our crop on. There's different types of soil, and there's really only 3. There's sand, silt, and clay. Loam is a combination of those three types of soil, right? So each have different water holding capacity, minerality, and drainage capacity, right? So ultimately what you want is soil that's well aerated, has good drainage, has high nutrients, right? Or not, depending on how you manage your vineyard and where you are, right? That's a whole nother conversation. But the soil plays a huge part into how productive the vines are and the flavors that are going to be produced, right? And how healthy they are. So that is why soil is such a big deal, right? So what's the deal, right? So we have to have good drainage. We want the vines to develop very deep set, sturdy roots. This will help result in longer living vines. We also, there's a difference between fertile and infertile soil. So if you have a vineyard on an infertile soil property, you'll have less grapes and fruit, but this could mean that those flavors are much more concentrated or intense in the fruit that does make it because it's so little, right? If you have fertile soil, this is great because this is healthy for the vine, right? But sometimes you'll have to drop some of the crop in order to achieve proper balance, right? So dropping crop means like your grapevine produces way more clusters than it needs to, and it's going to have a hard time ripening all those because it's overworking itself because it sees all this nutrients in the soil. So it's going to be like, I can do this. I'm just going to quadruple what I normally would make because all this nutrients are available. But then what will happen is during the ripening season, it won't produce enough sugars to fully ripen that fruit, develop those flavors, and then create a wine within the alcohol range that we need. So that's where dropping crop comes from. So you have to go through, thin out maybe 50% of the clusters that are there, drop them before they start to ripen, and then what's left behind will ripen to what you need it to be. So that is a very important concept. Okay, and then finally terrain, right? So terrain and surrounding plants. So differences in elevation and surrounding life. So is the vineyard on a mountain? Is it in the valley or is it near an ocean? What else grows there, right? What plants, microbes, flora are present? Elevation does have effects on climate, sun exposure, and airflow. And there's also like what are your local inhabitants? Native yeasts, plants, eucalyptus trees, flowers, like pennyroyal. These are all minty components that can leach into your wine and affect the flavor, and those can be very good flavors. I personally love eucalyptus and pennyroyal, but that's not everyone's cup of tea, right? So when you think about what's affecting your product, those are things that you're going to have to consider. Okay, lovely. So then we have our learning objectives. I hope this presentation was helpful for you guys. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I know I have a lot of folks who've already taken a lot of the viticulture classes enrolled in this course. I do have some new students as well too. So if you felt like I kind of went over something a little too fast or was a little confusing, please don't be shy to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to either give you some resources, talk to you about it. We can meet in person or over Zoom or over phone call, no problem. But that is the presentation. Definitely review these learning objectives before you take the quiz. It'll prepare you for the quiz. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you guys next time. All right, thanks for watching.